In an attempt to understand the meteoric rise in membership of the Mormon Church, I once stumbled upon a piece suggesting that the Rothschild family might have some sort of financial connection with the early church. While I have been unable to find any definitive evidence of any financial connection, what I did find surprised me, given the small size of the church at that time. Why, one has to wonder, would a concern like the Rothschilds, who were financiers of many significant historical events, including wars, infrastructure projects, and the formation of modern financial systems, take an interest in a small fledgling religion like the Mormon Church? There were, in fact, at least 2 different interactions with Mormon leadership that are documented in the historical record and the Journal of Discourses, among other places. But it is the historical context in which these interactions occurred that makes them interesting. For most of the 1800s, one of the more significant geopolitical events was the great rivalry between the British and Russian empires over influence in Central Asia, known as the Great Game. Towards the end of that period, several members of the Rothschild family dynasty were deeply involved in the development of the Zionist movement. In fact, when Britain finally overthrew the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Jerusalem in 1917, the letter from the British government expressing support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, known as the Balfour Declaration, was addressed to Lionel Walter Rothschild. In 1921, on the 4th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, and during the period when the Mandate for Palestine was being created, David O. McKay, who was already one of the Quorum of the 12 in the church, would travel to Jerusalem, despite civil unrest in the region, to pray on the Mount of Olives for the return of the Jews to their homeland, and to commemorate Orson Hyde's visit to the Mount of Olives in 1841. In 1922, the League of Nations gave Britain the power to administer the Mandate for Palestine. This didn't just establish a homeland for the Jews, it established legitimacy for foreign control in the region. From its very outset in 1830, the Mormon Church was outwardly sympathetic to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In June of 1832, the first edition of the First Church newspaper, the Evening and Morning Star, stated that it comes to bring good tidings of great joy to all people, but more especially to the house of Israel scattered abroad, that the day of their redemption is near, for the Lord hath set his hand again the second time to restore them to the lands of their inheritance. Article 10 of the Articles of Faith, first published in 1842, reads, "We believe in the literal gathering of Israel and in the restoration of the 10 tribes, that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisiacal glory." On October 21, 1841, prominent Mormon apostle Orson Hyde was sent on a mission to Jerusalem, ostensibly to dedicate the land for the gathering of Judah and the house of Israel. Hyde stayed in Jerusalem until Monday, October 25th. His notes from this mission are recorded in Chapter 26 of Volume 4 of History of the Church, under the subtitle, Elder Orson Hyde's Letter, his prayer of dedication on the Mount of Olives. Hyde's notes record his climbing up the Mount of Olives, overlooking the city just before dawn on October 24th, where he recited a dedicatory prayer, which included the excerpt, "Now, O Lord, thy servant has been obedient to the heavenly vision which thou gavest him in his native land, and under the shadow of thine outstretched arm he has safely arrived in this place to dedicate and consecrate this land unto thee, for the gathering together of Judah's scattered remnants, according to the predictions of the holy prophets, for the building up of Jerusalem again after it has been trodden down by the Gentiles so long, and for rearing a temple in honor of thy name." On March 10, 1872, church leader Orson Pratt delivered a discourse in the Salt Lake Tabernacle aptly named Zion. Interestingly, in this discourse, Pratt seems to convey, despite shared Zionist sympathies, a negative view of the Rothschilds in the following excerpt. "For you know, when the Rothschilds and the great bankers among the Jewish nation shall return back to their own land to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, carrying their capital with them, it will almost ruin some of the nations, and the latter will go up against Jerusalem to take a spoil, and they will succeed in taking half the city captive. And when they are in the act of destroying that city, behold, the Lord will come with all his saints, and he shall stand his feet on the Mount of Olives. And in that day, says the prophet Zechariah, shall the Lord go forth and fight against all those nations that have fought against Jerusalem, and their flesh shall consume away upon their bones, their eyes in their sockets. This great calamity comes upon the Jewish nation in consequence of their unbelief in the true Messiah. This reference can be found in Journal of Discourses, Volume 14, Discourse 46. A few years after Orson Pratt's discourse, in 1875, Baron Lionel de Rothschild traveled to Salt Lake, arriving on October 31st. A few days later, Rothschild, as well as Prince Frederick of Wittgenstein and Count Turenne, would visit with President Brigham Young. Unfortunately, details pertaining to the nature of this visit are not forthcoming, but references to these occasions can be found in the supplement to the historical record entitled Church Chronology, which is devoted to documenting important Mormon history. They are also documented on page 3 of the Deseret Evening News on November 4, 1875. On April 6, 1876, President of the Quorum of the 12, John Taylor, delivered a discourse at the Tabernacle, in which he alluded to a discussion he had had earlier with Baron Rothschild, in which the two men were discussing the purpose of the temple. This entire discourse is recorded in Volume 18 of the Journal of Discourses as Discourse number 23. This discussion with Rothschild can also be found on pages 292 and 293 of Taylor's own book, The Gospel Kingdom. The discussion, which Taylor states took place at the Townsend House, revolves around the purpose of the temple in Salt Lake City, as well as the baptism of sinners, particularly Indians, who have departed from the Word of God. But the discussion also includes the following interesting statement from Taylor to Lord Rothschild. "You will build a temple, for the Lord has shown us, among other things, that you Jews have quite a role to perform in the latter days, and that all things spoken by your old prophets will be fulfilled, that you will be gathered to Old Jerusalem, and that you will build a temple there." This could be in keeping with the negative view of the Jewish nation that Orson Pratt conveyed in the aforementioned discourse he delivered in 1872, if Taylor means to say that the Jews will play an important but negative role in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But he only states they have quite a role to perform, so it's ambiguous. Certain articles published in the LDS periodical, The Millennial Star, which was printed in England from 1840 to 1970, add still more ambiguity. On January 15, 1848, the Millennial Star published an article reprinted from the Herald for Europe entitled London Bankers, which can be summarized pretty well by the following excerpts. The monetary crisis in London and throughout England seems to have stopped in mid-career by the influence of the London bankers and government, and by the Bank of England. The bank was authorized to make issues of its paper, contrary to its charter, in order to sustain the credit of the country, but affairs gradually improved, even without the application of the physic. We are therefore in the midst of that lull, or calm, which follows after or precedes those movements created by the great capitalists and speculators for the purpose of filling their own pockets and cheating the rest of the world. The Rothschilds, Barings, and other extensive houses and bankers in London control the commercial world through the action of the Bank of England, the foreign exchanges, the bullion market of the world, and all by their vast capitals and power over the various governments, and by their combined movements on the money market, originated in London and carried into effect by their agents throughout the world. They raise the prices of the great articles of consumption, such as cotton, corn, or tobacco, as well as coin. They vary those movements upwards and downwards, backwards and forwards, just to suit their purposes, and to make money out of their operations. The British ministry, however, not only made the Rothschilds and their friends the depositories of those secrets useful to their speculations, but they also made panic speeches in the House of Commons for the purposes of increasing the prices of breadstuffs and delaying the reaction in the market. The Rothschild of Frankfurt is the oldest, but the most influential are those of London and Paris. They all profess to be Hebrews, strict Jews, but they care as much for their religion as they do for that of Hindustan. France, England, and all the other governments of Europe are covered with debt. But on March 15th of that same year, the Millennial Star published an article reprinted from Chambers' Edinburgh Journal entitled Memoir of the House of Rothschild, which presents a very different, if not glowing, account of the Rothschilds, including the following excerpts. It is usual to trace the origin of great families to some gallant exploit or some lucky accident, which suddenly raised the ancestor of the house from obscurity and provided him at the same time with a legend to his coat of arms. But there are other origins which it would be vain to endeavor to arrive at by a similar process. The origin of houses that rise steadily, not suddenly, in their peculiar career, and the success of which is not secured by a single incident, but distributed evenly over the lifetime of one or more generations. In such cases, the germ of prosperity must be sought for in the family mind, in the idiosyncrasy of the race, in the theory by which their conduct in the world is governed, and the first accident, which attracts the attention of the vulgar as the origin of their fortunes, merely a point d'appui selected by forethought and resolution. The rise of the House of Rothschild presents a very remarkable illustration of this view of a question which will never cease to be interesting, and affords a striking instance of the natural and simple means by which those vast results are obtained which it is customary to ascribe to chance or miracle. In short, the House of Rothschild became great because its affairs were conducted upon the most perfect system of mercantile tactics, and because the character of its members, partaking largely of that of the original banker of Frankfurt, combined many of those amiable qualities which secure popularity without forfeiting respect. They sought to make money by skill and industry, not parsimony. They gave a liberal share of their profits to all whose services were of use in attaining them. As mentioned, both of these two articles published in the Millennial Star were taken from other publications, namely the Herald for Europe and Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, respectively. However, neither provided authorship attribution. To conclude, there doesn't seem to be any definitive evidence of strong ties, financial or otherwise, between the Mormon Church and Rothschild interests. Nothing appears to have been documented regarding Lionel de Rothschild's visit with Brigham Young in 1875, and commentary made by Mormon leaders about the Rothschilds, as well as the direct interaction John Taylor had with Baron Rothschild, vary from being benign or ambiguous to even being indicative of being at odds in some ways. Nevertheless, it boggles the mind that there were any liaisons at all between a small fledgling religion and a wealthy noble banking family of Rothschild stature. Were these accounts recorded in their entirety? Probably not. If the Rothschilds are known for anything, they're known for their discretion. We can only wonder if perhaps the mutual Zionist sympathy may have been a catalyst for Rothschild involvement, whether in the very beginnings of the church, or perhaps later on, after the church had already been established. On the one hand, supporting, funding, or otherwise promoting an ideological movement sympathetic to Zionism on a global scale could certainly be seen as a means of promoting sympathy for the idea of foreign occupation and ultimately control of the most important culturally and geopolitically significant real estate on the planet, which was certainly the case, even long before the discovery of oil in Persia in 1908. Plural marriage and missionary work could certainly have been seen as a way of promoting a Zionist esprit on a global scale, and there were about 40,000 missionaries during the first century of the church alone. On the other hand, the negative view of the Rothschilds that some Mormon leaders appear to have had adds too much complexity to draw any hard, fast conclusions, as does the fact that disagreements and schisms have long since been a significant part of church history.